Hello friends, thank you for watching this video. I am Mohamad and I will be showing you today how to create a Docker Compose file for an ASP.NET Core application and the SQL Server Database utilizing the Entity Framework Code First approach. We will be creating a simple bookkeeping application where we will be able to add and view books. And we will be utilizing Docker Compose as it allows us to orchestrate multiple containers in a streamlined way. The two containers will be our SQL Server Database and our ASP.NET Core application. The four things that we will need before we start is Visual Studio Code, .NET Core SDK, Docker, as well as the Docker extension for Visual Studio Code. The four things that we'll need before we start is an IDE, .NET Core SDK, Docker, as well as an extension for Visual Studio Code. So we're gonna start by our SDK, which is gonna be .NET Core. Once we go to that link, all of the links will be available in the description down below. We have to click on download the .NET SDK. We're gonna be using the .NET 5.0 as it's the recommended one. It's a very simple installation process, and once we finish with that, we're gonna be downloading our IDE. Our IDE is gonna be Visual Studio Code. It's a simple as well download. Once we download it, we need to install it. The installation process is very simple and minimal. As I have already downloaded all of these before, I will not be doing it again. Similarly, we need to download our Docker application. It's a very simple installation process. Once we download it, it will take roughly around a few minutes to be installed. Once it's completed, we can see we have the Docker icon on our top right hand side. And we can see once we have everything running within Docker, we're gonna see Docker desktop is running. And the last thing that we're gonna be needing is an extension for Visual Studio Code, which is gonna be a Docker extension, which is gonna give us a lot of ability to debug and view what's actually going on when we run our Docker containers. So after installing all of our requirements, we need to make sure that our .NET SDK has been installed successfully. In order for us to do that, what we need to do is we need to open the terminal by clicking on Command Spacebar on Windows and typing terminal. And once we are in our terminal, what we need to do is we need to type .NET --version. And as we can see, we see the .NET version number, which is 5.0.102. So this means we are on the latest version of the .NET SDK. If you have any other number, it could be 5.0.0, 3.1, any version, or in the future it could be 5.1, which is gonna be fine. If you see any other message other than the number, then you have an issue with your SDK, then you need to re-download the SDK and reinstall it again. So before we start as well, we need to make sure that our Entity Framework tool is available for us to use. For that, we're gonna be using the .NET tool install -- global, because it's gonna be available globally within our OS. And we're gonna put .NET EF. I have already installed this one, but if you didn't, it's gonna take roughly around 10 seconds to be installed. Once we have all of these requirements set and ready, what we need to do is to create our application right now. So for us to do that, we're gonna be using the .NET new keyword. We're gonna put .NET new MVC. We're gonna give it a name of book management. And we're gonna give it the lang C#. We don't really have to do that, but I like to do it for consistency. And we're not gonna use any authentication. If you're interested in authentication within ASP.NET Core, I have another video which I can link within the cards on the top right hand side or the left hand side, and I will leave a description, the link in the description down below. So once we do that, we click on enter, and we can see we have an issue. Oh, I have put an M instead of an N for the name. Now, after we click on enter, we can see our .NET SDK is building the application for us, which is great. So once we have this and ready, all we need to do is just open our code editor, which is going to be Visual Studio Code. So now after the IDE has been open, all we need to do is we need to add the terminal directly. So we need to click on view and click on terminal. And we can see our terminal has shown up here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to navigate to our folder. So we need to type cd book management, and then once we are here, we need to build the application, make sure it's building successfully. and as we can see, it's building, and after a few seconds it will give us the build succeed. So the next step is we need to add all of our packages. So we have basically 3 packages that we'd like to add in order for us to utilize the entity framework. So the first thing is we need to type .NET add package Microsoft dot entity framework core. This is gonna take a few seconds to install. Then we need to install our second package, .NET add package Microsoft dot entity framework core dot SQL Server, since we're going to be utilizing SQL Server. And the last one is going to be .NET add package Microsoft dot entity framework core dot design. Perfect. So now we have our 3 packages. In order for us to verify that, all we need to do is we can go to the left hand side, open our project, and we can click on bookmanagement.csproj, and we can see we have the 3 references available here for us, which is great. So the next step is we need to build the application and run it to make sure that everything is running smoothly. So for us, in order for us to do that, we're going to be using .NET build to build the application, and then we're going to be using .NET run, and we can see the application is running on port 5000 for HTTP and 5001 for HTTPS. So let's go to our browser and let's navigate to HTTP localhost 5000, and we can see our application is running as it should be, which is great. So right now, after we see our application is running as it should be, what we need to do is we need to add our Docker file. Our Docker file will be added on our root directory, and for us to do that, let's first navigate back to our editor. Let's stop the application, and then within our application directory, we'll add a new file. We'll call it Docker file, and the D has to be capital when creating this file, or it will not be correct because it's case sensitive. So once we create our Docker file, what we need to do is we're gonna add our commands. I will not be delving deep into every command, what does it mean, but I'll give a brief explanation. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna be adding the from keyword, and basically this is gonna tell Docker where to pull in the main image that we're gonna be using. So the first image is gonna be the Microsoft.NET SDK /.NET /SDK : 5.0, and we're gonna name this as our build environment. So the second thing is we're gonna be defining the work directory, and we're gonna name it app. After that, we're gonna be copying our csproj file from our local environment to our new container. So we're gonna call the copy keywords, and then we're gonna put star because we don't want to identify every csproj independently, and then we put .csproj, and then we'll put // it means it's gonna copy it to the root directory of our container, and then we're gonna use the run keyword in order for us to use .NET restore, so all of the packages will be restored. After that, we're gonna be copying the rest of the code, so we'll put copy .space . So we're gonna copy everything from our root directory into the root directory of our container, and then we're gonna put run .NET. Basically, we're gonna publish this application. publish dash C. We're gonna release it, so it's gonna be a release, and we're gonna specify the output. After we finish from that, now we're gonna finalize our production image. We're gonna call it from again mcr dot microsoft.com /.net /SDK 5.0. We're gonna specify a new work directory for this image. We're gonna call it as well app. And the last thing is before last, we're gonna copy everything from the build environment to our new environment. So from equal build environment to our app /out to our root directory. And the last thing is our entry point. What's the command that's gonna be running once this container is up and running? We'll put .NET, and we're gonna be taking the name of the DLL, which is gonna be basically book management. We can check it from here. .dll. Okay, great. Let's save this. An extra step that we can do in order for us to ease our development process is to specify a specific port so our application will run. So in order for us to do that, we need to go to the program.cs, and within our web builder, we just type web builder .use URLs, specify which URL the application will run on, and we'll just use HTTP. Doesn't matter the domain, and we'll run it on port 80. And we'll update our Docker file, so we'll open port 80 directly from there. So we'll just type expose, and we'll put port 80, and that's it. So once we have this saved, what we can do is we can start building our container. So how do we do that? Build our image. So in the command prompt we type docker build -t, and we'll give it a name, book management, and space, and then we'll put dot. We have to put the dot because dot tells it where to find the actual Docker file in order for it to build. And we click on enter. It's gonna take a few seconds to build. As we can see, the build process is running, and it has built successfully because at the end it has created the image for us, which is great. Right now, in order for us to test if this Docker image is running, what we can do is we can type docker run. Let's specify which port are we gonna connect with. So we'll put port 8080, and we're gonna connect to the internal port 80, and we'll call it book management, and we click on enter, and now we can see the application is running on port 80 on the inside and port 8080 on the outside. So now let's try to connect, and now let's change the port to port 8080, and now we should see the application running, which is great. So in order for us to summarize what we did so far is we created the .NET Core application. It's a very simple application. We just updated our startup class, as well as we created the Docker file. The Docker file basically just took the application and published it in an environment container, and then it copied everything to another container. We specified which URL is going to be using within that application, and once we did that, we tested it out, and we can see that the application is running successfully, which is great. Right now, let's stop this. The next step for us is to add our models. So in order for us to add our models, we go to the models folder within our root directory, and we add a new class. Let's call this new class book, And this book is gonna be book class gonna be very simple. All it's gonna contain is two properties. The first one is gonna be an ID of type int, and the second one is gonna be a name. Perfect. So once we do that, the next step for us is to create our application DB context. So what we do is within our root directory, we click create a new folder. We'll call it data. Within this data folder, we create a new class. We'll call it application DB context. Once we have that class created, we then directly inherit from the DB context class. Basically, once we inherit from the DB context class, our application DB context will become a representation of our database within entity framework. So let's fix the references. Perfect. The next step for us is we need to declare our dataset. So public DB set, and we'll put book. Basically, this will allow us to create a table in our database called book, and we'll name this table books. We'll fix the references. And the last thing that we need to do is to define our constructor. So the constructor is gonna be DB context options. We're gonna define the application DB context options, and then we're gonna send this to our base class. Since we are inheriting from the DB context class, we need to send the DB context option directly to the base class. So once we do that, we need to update right now our startup.cs in order for it to take our connection string. So let's go to the startup.cs class, and inside our configure services, we're gonna first define our configurations. So we're gonna be defining the server, the port, the user, the password, as well as our database. So first of all, let's define our server. We're gonna take it from the configuration, and we're gonna be calling it database server. The second step is we're gonna define the port. Database port, and in case there's nothing within the configuration, we just return an empty string. The third is our user. So far, we call it user equal configuration database user. Similarly, if it's empty, we return an empty string. Var password configuration database password. And finally, we need to define the database. So we'll call var database equal configuration database name, and if it's empty, we return an empty string. After we have defined our variables, right now what we need to do is we need to create our DB context and inject it into our services. So for us to do that, we'll just type services .add DB context. We'll put application DB context. This is the name of the class that we have created. We can fix the references before we continue. Now we need to create the options, and then we can define these options. So basically within these options, we're gonna be telling SQL Server. We're gonna be telling our application DB contacts what type of server, database server we're gonna be using. So it's gonna be use SQL Server, and finally here we're gonna have our connection string. So let's fix the references. It's use, not user. Okay, and now, okay, great. Now let's create our connection string. So we'll put var connection string equal, and now what we're gonna do is we're gonna be concatenating all of those strings together. So in order for us to do that, first we're gonna put server equal, we'll put the server, and then we'll have to define the port. After that, we're gonna use the initial catalog to define our database. And then we're gonna give the database name. After that, it's gonna be our user ID, database user, it's gonna be user, sorry. And lastly, we're gonna be defining our password equal password. Once we have this ready, we just put this inside here. So this connection string will be built using the variables that we have sent here, and after that it will be passed to our SQL Server, and then it will be passed to our application DB context, which is great. So now, just to make sure that everything is still running, let's put .NET build perfect. The application is succeeded, build succeeded. The next step for us is we need to create our initial migration. So how do we do that? It's very simple. We're going to be using the EF framework within .NET. So we're going to put .NET EF data migrations, and we're going to call it initial migration. It's going to be the first migration that we do. Once it's ready, we can see on the left hand side we're going to be having a new folder which is called migration, and this folder basically it's going to have the new table that we have created, and this code by itself it's going to be converted into SQL, and then it's going to be applied to our database. So great. Right now, just to have a quick summary, we have built our application, we have created our application DB context, we hooked up the connection string, and we created our first migration. But we're not gonna be directly migrating these changes to our database. Why? Because we're gonna be using SQL Server within a Docker container in order to have it as our database server. Since that container is not running, we cannot really do any migration. So in order for us to facilitate the entire process of automatically migrating all of the scripts to that database, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a database management service which is going to be hooking up to our startup class in order for it to be responsible to apply all of the migration that happens directly to our database. So for us to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it services inside the root directory of the application. So we'll call it services. And inside the services folder, we create a new class. We'll call it database management service. And let's make this class static. And then we'll have a method inside this class. We'll call it public static. It's gonna be void, and we're gonna call it migration initialization. and we're gonna pass the application builder. Okay, great. So let's fix the references first. After we do that, we're gonna just basically initiate a scope from that application builder, and then using that scope that we have created, we're gonna be initiating an application DB context and then use entity framework core in order for us to ensure that all of the migration has been applied. So it's a very simple piece of code, and let's see how we do that. So we're gonna be typing using var, we're gonna name a service scope, and we're gonna be using the app dot application services dot create scope. The create scope here, we have to fix the references because it's gonna be referring to the ASP.NET dependency injection. So once we do that, it's gonna be as simple as referencing to the service scope that we have created. We're gonna go to service provider. We're gonna get which service we're gonna initiate, and it's gonna be the application DB contacts. Let's fix the references. Okay, great. And then we have to initiate it, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna put database, and then we're just gonna type migrate, and then we're gonna close it, and this is it. Let's fix the references first. So what does this mean? So just to summarize, this is a static class that we're gonna inject into our startup class in order to ensure that the database entity framework will automatically update the database with all of the migration scripts that we have. So the first thing that we did is we passed the application builder, which is going to be sending from the startup class. We created a scope. This scope basically is going to be utilizing the application services, and then it's going to be creating like an object from those services for us to utilize. Once that service scope has been created, we're going to be choosing the service providers. In our case right now, we're going to be using the application DB context, and then from here on we're going to be connecting to our database, and once we have connected to our database, we'll be utilizing the entity framework core in order for us to migrate all of the changes directly to the database. Perfect. So the next step for us is to go to the startup class, and inside the configure method on top, all we're gonna type is database management service. Let's fix the references, and then we're gonna call basically the only method that exists is gonna be migrate initialization, and we're gonna be putting the app, passing the app, which is the iWeb host environment, the application builder. Great. So once we do that, our next step basically is just to continue working on our controllers and have basically our book controller, which is going to be using to create a book and view all of the books. And after that, we're going to be creating the views. Once we do that, we're going to jump into the exciting stuff of how to create a Docker compose file and how to stitch everything together. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is inside the controllers folder, we're going to create a new class. We're going to call it books controller. We're going to inherit from the controllers class. Perfect. Once we do that, what we need to do is we're gonna be initializing our application DB context. So for us to do that, we're gonna put private, gonna make it read only application DB context, and we're gonna name it context. and then we're gonna define the constructor. We're gonna be sending application db context equal context, which is great. Now it's gonna be simple as defining 3 actions. The first one is gonna be public action result. It's gonna call index. We're gonna get all of the books. So we're gonna create a new variable, call it books, equal underscore context dot books dot toList. This simple function is gonna connect to our database. We're gonna go to the books table, and then it's gonna create a list using the system.link, and then we're just gonna return it to the view, and we're gonna return the books to the view as well. Very simple stuff. The second part is we're gonna be creating our create. So we're gonna put the attribute get public action result create, and then put return view. And the last action is gonna be also create, but we're gonna be sending back, which is gonna be a post. So we're gonna put HTTP post public. It's gonna, let's make it async. Let's put a task, and we're gonna return an action result. And we'll call it create, and we're gonna be sending back a book. We'll call it book. Perfect. And now let's just fix those references. So the first thing is the task. We're gonna be using system threading, and book we're gonna be using the models. Perfect. So what shall we do now? For the first thing is, once we wanna do a post, we're gonna verify the model state that we have. So it's gonna be simple if model state dot is valid. If it's valid, we'll continue. If not, we just return to the view, and we're gonna send back the object that got sent. And let's add a nice error message. Model state dot add model error. Gonna be string dot empty for now. This is a very simple implementation. We can delve more deep into later videos if you guys want that. But something went wrong, and then if it all is good, let's create a try catch, because we're gonna be communicating with a database. Put the exception, and let's put model state dot add model error, also string dot empty, and it's gonna be just gonna send back the error. We'll put something went wrong, and we just pass the message. And now let's fix the references that we have for the exception. We're gonna be using system, and then we're just gonna create the database code to order for us to save, which is gonna be basically just calling the context, going to the books, add book, and then it's gonna be just have to, so basically once we write underscore context books dot add, it's gonna take this object and prepare it to be saved in our database. So it's gonna be saving it into memory, and in order for us to commit those changes, we need to first await, because it's gonna be writing to the database context dot save changes async, and that's it. What we need to do is we want to redirect back to the index page once it's successful. Redirect to action and just redirect to the index page. And that's it. Now we have our our controller ready, and everything is there. Let's save everything that we're using, and then let's build this application to make sure everything is still building. Okay, perfect. Now we can see the application is building successfully. So the next step after that is we need to create the views. So within the view folders, we're gonna create a new folder. We're gonna name it books. The first thing is we're gonna create a new view, so new file. We'll call it index.cs HTML, and the view for that is gonna be very simple. We're gonna be adding an href to the create action in order for us to be able to create a book, and we're gonna call it books, and we'll call it create book, and let's give it a nice class. It's gonna be class btn-success, for example. And after that, we're gonna create a simple UL, an ordered list, and we're gonna loop at the model, or we didn't define the model. So let's define the model. We're gonna be basically, this view is gonna be handling a list of books. So it's gonna be as simple as add model. We're gonna define a list and list of books. So it's gonna be book management dot models dot book. Perfect. And now we'll just loop on that model. So for each, we'll call it book, and it's gonna be model. Okay, great. And within the for each, we're gonna define an li, and we're just gonna print the name. So book dot name. Okay, great. So that's the index. The next step is the create view. So basically we just right click here, new file, we'll call it create.cs HTML, and it's gonna be a simple, first let's define the model before we forget. So it's gonna be book management dot models dot book, and then it's gonna be a simple form, asp action equal create, and then asp dash controller equal books, and then we're gonna define the method, which is gonna be post, because it's gonna be posting the book to the controller. After that, we're just gonna define a div class row, and then within that row we're gonna define a div. We're just using the bootstrap default classes, class call dash md dash 12. After that, we're just gonna be creating another div which is gonna be hosting our input. So div class, it's gonna be form group, because we're gonna be grouping a label and a label as well as an input field. Okay, and then within this div we're just gonna use a label, and this label we're gonna call it book name. Perfect. And then we're gonna be using input ASP4, we're gonna put it for the name itself, and then it's gonna be of type text. And let's give it a class. It's gonna just be form control. And I think that's more than enough. Oh yeah, let's give it a placeholder. We'll call it please enter book name. Okay, great. So once we do that and we have it all set, since we are returning error messages in case something went wrong, so let's create another div. We'll give it a class form group as well, and it's gonna be as simple as creating an inside div asp-validation summary equal all, which means that we're gonna return all of the issues that the controller is gonna throw back, and we're gonna give it a class of text danger, which is gonna give it some nice format and some nice colors in case something goes wrong. And the last thing is we're just gonna have to create buttons in order for us to submit. So we create a div, we'll just add a button of type submit, so it will submit the form. We'll give it a class of btn success, so it will be green, and we'll name it create a book. The last thing we want to do is a simple redirection if we want to cancel. So asp-action equal index, so we're gonna go back to the index in case we don't wanna, if we're gonna cancel this. So it's gonna be book, and the control is gonna be asp-controller. We're gonna be referring back to the books one, and we'll give it a class of btn, and we'll call it cancel. Okay, great. So basically this finalize almost all of the changes that we need to do our application. So to do a quick summary, once we have created our application DB contacts, we just created our controllers, and we created 3 actions, which is going to be the index to show all of the books, created a get for the create, so it will give us an empty view, and then we created a post where it's going to be processing all of the processing the requests that we have made, which is going to be adding a book. The last thing that I would like to add is just a simple URL on the layout page, so we can click directly and go to the page of books management. So we just copy this, and instead of home, we just call it book, and action is going to be index, and we'll name this href books. Perfect. This is it. Now we get to the exciting part, which is gonna be creating our Docker Compose file. So the Docker Compose file is it's a YAML file, which is gonna allow us to create multiple images and build them in order for multiple images, and it allows us to build them and run those containers together. So how do we do that? In our root directory, very simply, we'll create a new file, and this file we're going to be called docker, all lowercase letter, -compose .yml. The YML is going to define the extension of a YAML file. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define the version of this YAML file, and we're going to be using the 3 version. So after we define our version, the next step is within this YAML file, what is it gonna do? We need to define services. So in order for us to do that, so basically the application is a service, the database server is a service. If we have, for example, Redis caching, it's another service. So the first thing in our YAML file, we define the version, and then we define the services. Then we're gonna define our database server, because it has to be created before the application. We're gonna call this MS SQL-server, and be careful, in the YAML file, indentation is really important. So as you can see here, in order to define a service, we did the indentation, and then after that I have to do another one. So it's gonna be image, and we're gonna be calling the SQL Server image from Docker Hub, so mcr microsoft.com/MSSQL/server 2017. We're gonna be using the latest one, and we're gonna be using the Ubuntu version, Ubuntu. Perfect. So after that, this is gonna be the images, and in order for us to utilize this, we need to pass some arguments. So how do we pass the arguments in order for us to utilize it? We're gonna have to create an environment attribute, environment, and again the tab, because it needs to be consistent with the spacing. Basically the requirement for SQL Server is gonna be first accept the EULA, so we're gonna put yes, we accept it. The second one is we're gonna define the SA password. Okay, so it's really bad to, it's not at all recommended to define the SA password in a plain text within our Docker Compose, but since this is gonna be only for demoing the abilities of Docker Compose, it's fine for this scenario, but usually it's not, it's frowned upon. It's really not good practice to put the password here. So for now we're just gonna be using it, and we're gonna put it as Docker 2021. And the last thing is we're gonna be defining the which version of SQL Server we want. So we're gonna put MSSQL underscore PID, and then we're gonna be using the Express version. Perfect. So after we define the image, after we define the environment, what should we define? We should define which ports are we gonna be connecting. For this reason, for this demo, we're gonna be using the defaults one, which come with MSSQL, which is gonna be the 1433 and 14433. It's gonna be very easy. So basically we're just mapping from the internal to the internal ports, external to the internal ports on the same port, which is 1433. So that's finalized our first service. Again, we need to pay very good attention to the tabbing. The second service is gonna be our books application. So we're gonna call it book-app, and that's what we can do is we can define directly again the build variables here, but if we just type build space dot, it will automatically pick up the Docker file from our root directory, which is what we want, instead of repeating the code. And the last thing we want is we want to define the ports of this application, similarly what we'll do if we're gonna run it within the command prompt. So we're just gonna be connecting, let's use port 8090, and we connect to port 80 because we have already defined port 80 from the inside within the startup class, the programming class, if you remember. Okay, great. So once we do that, let's make sure we save it. And the next step for us is to use how are we gonna run this. So basically, in order for us to run a single Docker image, we use Docker build, we gave it a tag, and then we put a dot, and this built the image for us, and then we use Docker run using that name and the ports in order for us to run. But how are we gonna use a Docker Compose? It's very easy using the CLI that is provided for us. What we can do is we can just type .NET, Docker -compose, and we're gonna put up. It means when we put the word up, basically it's gonna initiate everything within the Docker file. So it's gonna make all of our services. Currently we have only 2 services. It's gonna run them, and then it's gonna run the containers. So it's gonna build the images, and then it's gonna run the containers. So that's what does Docker-compose up means. So just to make sure that all of our images are downloaded and rebuilt so nothing is cached, I would like always to pass the --build flag. This will force Docker Compose to rebuild the images for us. And we click on enter. Usually the first time it could cause us some errors until everything is initiated. In case it does that, all we need to do is restart it again. And we're still seeing that Docker is running. It has initiated the database. It's trying to build the application. And right now we have to wait, and we can see it has failed. Let's try to stop it and run it again. Okay, still failing. Why? Which is very good. There's a very good explanation for it why it's failing. Because if you remember, within our startup class, we haven't defined these variables, and it's all gonna be empty, 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 empty. So how do we define these variables from within the Docker compose file so we can fix this issue? Which is gonna be very simple. Below the build environment, we're just gonna type environment again, and then we're gonna define our configuration directly from here. So if we go to the startup class, we know we have database server. So let's take this. Don't forget the indentation, and then we're gonna call this the same name of our service here. So it is gonna be quotation ms SQL dash server. Perfect. What's the second thing? Which is gonna be the database port. The database port is gonna be, as we have configured here, 1433. So let's copy it again, sorry. And let's go to the Docker compose, and we'll paste it, and we'll put, it's gonna be 1433. So the next step is gonna be the database user. Again, as mentioned earlier, it's really not good practice to log in as SA, but for demo purposes we're gonna be using it, so it will save us a bit of time than creating all of those users and creating the scripts for them. After we create the database user, now we need to pass the database password, and we can see from the service above we have put the password Docker 2021, so we can use the same one, because basically we're from this app is connecting to this server using those credentials. And the last one that we're gonna do is we're gonna put the database that's gonna be automatically created for us. So we'll take database name and we'll put it here, and for this reason we're gonna call this database booksdb. Very simple. So now let's try to do another first Docker build -t, call it books management. This is just to make sure that the image is building properly and there is nothing wrong with it. So once we do that and make sure everything is running as it should be, then we'll use a Docker compose up. Okay, it's building. Now we use Docker dash compose up dash dash build, and now we can see the application is building again because we defined the dash dash build. And just we wait a few seconds, it's building the SQL server. We can see it's running, and we can see the initialization, and at the end we can see here that the application has run successfully on port 80 within the container. So from the outside it's going to be connecting using 8090. So let's try that out. Let's go to port 8090, and now we can see we have the books link has shown, which is great. If we click on it, we don't have any books because we haven't created any. Let's create a new book. We'll call it book 1, and let's create it, and we can see we have book 1 created. Let's create another book, book 2, and book 2 are created, and so on and so forth. Let's call it book 3. Perfect. So right now what we have is we have our books management running within our books management web application, which is running within a container, and we have our SQL server, which is running within another container, and they are communicating with each other using the Docker Compose network. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. When we create a Docker Compose file similar to this one, the Docker Compose CLI will create a network, and this network will put those two containers under the same network. So let's say, for example, if we want to create run the image of the application by itself and then run the SQL server by itself without Docker Compose, these two containers will not be able to communicate with each other, because one of the main benefit of Docker is the isolation, and because every container is going to be self-isolated from the other one, it will not be able to communicate. So, but when we do put it inside a Docker compose file, that single file is considered as one network. So these two containers will be able to see each other, and they will be able to communicate with each other. Yeah, okay, great. That's what I wanted to mention. Sorry, I forgot to mention it earlier. So basically, this summarize and our application for today. It's basically how we can utilize Docker Compose in order for us to create an ASP.NET Core application with SQL Server. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and comment for any types of video that you'd like to see, or any future topics that you'd like me to cover. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day ahead. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.